Now, Wellness Wednesday on Fox 54 News, sponsored by Regenesis.
So let's start off, of course, as we're recording right now, we're just a couple of days away from Thanksgiving. And of course, food safety is something important, especially with all the Thanksgiving meals that people are getting ready to partake within this season of the holidays. Let's just start off. What are some of the biggest offenders of kind of practices people might do to kind of spread germs and bacteria with food?
Okay, so I think one of the top would be the use of food thermometers. So when we talk about a lot of our meat products, poultry, a lot of our beef, food thermometers are very, very important because we need to make sure that our food reaches an internal temperature, the correct internal temperature, to kill all of those pathogenic organisms that we hear about in the news, such as Salmonella, E. coli, Campylobacter.
And when you talk about kind of that prep, especially with the food thermometer, I'm sure washing utensils, washing any accessories to make sure that food is cooked properly is extremely important.
Yes, washing is extremely important. First of all, washing your hands often during the cooking process. Of course, 20 seconds is what is recommended with warm soap and water. And also ensuring that you're washing those utensils that are being used, your forks, your cutting boards. Very, very important. And also as it relates to that brings me to my next point about cross-contamination. Being sure that you keep raw products separate from those products that will not be cooked before they are consumed.
And now, I want to talk about cross-contamination for a second because, of course, allergies are also a big thing, especially you might have family members with different allergies. How important is it to make sure that you have separate foods for those who might have an allergy of some kind?
Well, I think when you're going to have guests at your house, that's the question that you want to really ask first. That's commonly done even in conference settings. So you want to be sure that you have a good understanding of those individuals who have allergens, such as gluten, of course, is a big one these days. And also, while you're preparing the food, being sure that you keep, again, separate those foods that contain those allergens that you do not want in those foods that will be consumed by those individuals.
All right. Now, real quick, I want to talk a little bit about cooking because for some people, of course, they're going to be making their own food. Turkey, especially with Thanksgiving coming up, it can be a tough bird to cook.
Yes.
When it comes to cooking, some people might say, it's a little pink. Who cares? Is it important for poultry, especially, to be cooked thoroughly this holiday season?
Absolutely. USDA had a campaign several years ago. It was the Thermi campaign that said you can't tell by looking. So the use of those thermometers is very, very critical because that is really the only way to know that your product, in this case the turkey, reaches the appropriate internal temperature. So it's very critical to food safety.
And when you talk about, of course, those turkeys also, defrosting, for some people, they might just say, okay, I'm going to leave it out on the counter overnight and just, hopefully it's soft enough tomorrow I can throw it in the oven. Right. Is that a safe practice at all? Or what should people be doing when it comes to defrosting?
Absolutely not. We really want to make sure that we impress upon consumers that turkey should be defrosted in the refrigerator. And usually the amount of time that you defrost it is depending upon the number of pounds that are involved. So the reason we don't want to thaw at the counter is because a lot of the pathogenic organisms such as Campylobacter, E. coli, Salmonella, they like to grow at those temperatures. So we have to make sure that we are thawing at the correct temperature, which in this case would be refrigeration.
All right. Now, of course, with the holidays, leftovers are almost a part of what's expected with these meals. And, when it comes to storage, it probably can be tough because you have all this food and so little time to eat it. What's the best practices when it comes to food storage, especially with these holiday meals?
Yes, of course, because a lot of times you're cooking large volumes of food and you don't want to throw it away. So the recommendation is to be sure that those products are kind of put into smaller packages. So you don't want to take a whole pan of dressing and put that whole pan in the refrigerator. You really want to break it down into smaller portions so that it can cool faster.
And when you talk about being able to have those smaller portions, how long should people expect that food to last? Because there might be some people who say, oh, it's going to be in the fridge, I can eat it 2 weeks later and I'll be fine.
Right. Usually 3 to 4 days. After that, you really want to throw it away unless you are going to freeze it. So of course, if you freeze it, it will last longer in the freezer. But at refrigeration temperatures, you don't want to be eating that food a week out.
When it comes to, let's say there's a scenario where you did store something correctly, but it happens to get punctured, there's a hole in maybe the foil or some scenario like that. Should you still eat that food if you notice some kind of hole or maybe in a way where air could get into there?
So the issue with the puncture is that, for example, if you have a meat product, the liquid part can get out and it can contaminate, other things within the environment. So then you want to make sure that you're double sealing things. You want to make sure that you are storing it in a leak-proof container so that when you have it there, it has a secondary containment to catch it. One other key component is a lot of times we cook this food and it's on the stove, and you may have some individuals that come a little later, but 2 hours really is the recommendation for leaving food at room temperature. After that 2 hour period, it should be stored in the refrigeration so that those guests that may come a little later or those guests that are there that may want a second portion, it is safely stored for them.
So let's just start off, during the holiday season, what are some of the biggest offenders that you find that kind of violate the rules of food safety?
Sure. So some of the biggest offenders are improper thawing of your turkey, insufficient hand and surface cleaning, not using a food thermometer, leaving the food in the temperature danger zone for too long, and this is controversial, but cooking stuffing inside the turkey, and we can talk about that in a little bit.
Yeah, so actually, I want to start off with cooking, especially poultry, because a lot of people, this time of year, especially, they're trying to cook a turkey and they're trying to do it usually pretty fast or last minute. For some people, they might cook a turkey and it might be a little underdone. They say, okay, little pink is fine. Is that really the truth?
That is not the truth. So turkey, you want to get to an internal temperature of 165 degrees. So a food thermometer is your best friend. Obviously using the thermometer correctly and putting it in the thickest part of the turkey to make sure it's completely done and reaches that internal temperature.
And you mentioned also, of course, stuffing when it comes to a turkey. Of course, that also it has another game bird with chicken in it. That's probably not the best way to cook it though, when it comes to stuffing it inside another thick meat animal.
Right. So my thought is to not put stuffing in the bird. It's the bird acts kind of like it holds the coolness of that stuffing in, and you would have to get your stuffing to an internal temperature of 165 degrees Fahrenheit, just like the turkey or chicken or whatever it is you're stuffing. The problem is by the time that insulated stuffing gets to 165 degrees, your turkey or your chicken's going to be overdone and dry. So it's best to just cook the stuffing outside of the turkey and serve it alongside.
And of course, when we talk about cooking, especially with turkey, defrosting, you mentioned it a little bit when it comes to the offenders of that. But there's might be some people who just say, okay, I'm just going to put a plate underneath it. I'm just going to let it sit out overnight and just let it go. Based on that reaction, I'm going to guess that's not what you recommend at all.
Definitely not what I recommend. So that's always a big question. The best way to thaw your turkey is in the refrigerator. But that takes 24 hours for every 4 to 5 pounds. So sometimes people get to Thanksgiving Day and it's not completely thawed, and you definitely don't want to cook it while it's still frozen. So again, best way is in the refrigerator. Other ways you can do it, you can put it in cold water. So you would keep it in its original packaging that's, seal proof, nothing can get into it, and put it in a bowl of water, submerge it cold water. But you would have to change the water every 30 minutes. So that still can take quite a bit. And then you must cook it immediately. The fastest way to thaw it is in the microwave. The problem with that, though, is everybody's used a microwave before, and sometimes it starts cooking stuff while it's defrosting. So you might get the turkey to start cooking while you're thawing it. And then also it must be cooked immediately after thawing it in the microwave. And the directions for that would be dependent upon your microwave's instruction manuals, because there's different wattages and whatnot. So the best is to plan ahead and let it thaw in your refrigerator.
I completely understand that. Now, you mentioned kind of talking about serving, especially, when it comes to there's going to be a lot of people around for these meals. When it comes to especially handling food, what are some of the best tips you have when it comes to serving, sides, turkey, basically everything that's going to be offered on one of these meals?
So when it comes to serving, before we get to serving, we get to prep. And we want to make sure we don't cross-contaminate our foods. So if you only have one cutting board, you want to cut your raw vegetables and do all of that prep work first, and then wash it, rinse it, clean it really good before you start doing any raw meats or proteins. If you have two cutting boards, that's great. You can reserve one for your produce and reserve one for your meat. So that's our first step, is to not cross-contaminate. Obviously, we also want to, whether it's uncooked or cooked, we want to wash our hands and surfaces frequently so we don't cross-contaminate between our foods. When it comes to serving, if at all possible, keeping your hot foods hot, cold food cold. So that also plays a role in transporting. A lot of us go to families or friends' houses, making sure that we're keeping our products outside of the temperature danger zone. And this is probably the hardest thing, is your food can only really be out for 2 hours after cooking, and then it needs to be put in the refrigerator. So once that 2 hour mark hits, we need to go ahead and put it in shallow containers so it can cool quickly in the refrigerator. But that's hard to do because we're all enjoying family. We have that food coma, but we really need to get it in the refrigerator.
Mm. And you mentioned vegetables, and I want to ask about this. A lot of vegetarian options are becoming much more popular, especially these days. I want to ask, is there any kind of food safety tips you would have when it comes to vegetarian meals? Maybe something someone might not think about when it comes to kind of prepping for that.
So with your vegetarian meals, your produce, since you don't have any animal products, you're not going to have too much to worry about. Eggs, dairy products, but again, it's all about temperature control and making sure you reach the final endpoint temperature and avoiding cross-contamination. So even if you're following a vegetarian meal plan, you still need to worry about cross-contamination. You still need to worry about endpoint temperatures.
And speaking of contamination, of course, allergies. What would you do? What would you say for someone who's prepping, but they know I have someone with peanut allergy, or someone has, it's an allergy to certain kinds of different ingredients. What would you say to for the best, do food prep, but make sure we don't cause an allergic reaction?
Absolutely. We don't want to do that. So the best thing to do is to not have it at all if possible. If somebody's allergic to peanuts, then just don't have any peanuts in your dishes. But if it is something that you want to still serve, having dedicated utensils, dedicated plates, dedicated, not, knives, cutting boards, and again, washing your hands. Like I would do your allergen first and get it out of the way. Not get it out of the way, but make sure it's not cross-contaminated with anything, and then you can do your other products after that. And then obviously labeling it and letting um your family and friends know that this has some potential allergens in them and you want to avoid that. So I would put them like totally on a different table, just out of the way. So there's no chance of anybody taking a spoon out of something and then using it in a different dish. They needed their own dedicated space, utensils, serving dishes so that we don't have that cross contamination.
All right. Coming up to one of my final questions. Of course, leftovers. That's a big part of this meal, but also storage. It is important because there's some people who might leave there a little too long. What are your tips when it comes to kind of keeping the food both safe, but also saying, okay, it's time to throw it out?
That's a great question. So you're right. People, like I said, you get comfortable, you're full, you get that food coma and your food sits out. So the big thing, as I mentioned earlier, is your food needs to go back in the refrigerator within 2 hours after cooking. And I can't put a ginormous container in there because it's not going to cool down fast enough. I need to spread it into shallow containers. So as long as I store it properly, no more than 2 hours outside, and in shallow containers, I can safely store my leftovers in the refrigerator for about 3 to 4 days. I can freeze some of my leftovers for about 2 to 6 months in the freezer. The big thing then is when you go to reheat, you want to reheat only what you're going to eat, not the whole dish. And then taking a serving out and putting it back in the refrigerator, because that takes it through the temperature danger zone too often. So reheating just what you're going to eat for that meal, and using a thermometer again to get it to the proper internal temperature to make sure that everything is safe.
What are some of the biggest offenders you usually see that would people kind of violate food safety rules?
Leaving their food out too long. The golden rule is to leave your foods, any type of food, no longer than 2 hours. Another violation that I see is how people prepare their turkey. The turkey needs to be thawed out for allow 24 hours for every 4 to 5 pounds of turkey that you have. Don't thaw the turkey on the counter. It is not to be thawed in the sink. The best way to thaw your turkey, regardless of the weight, is in the refrigerator in a container. On the bottom shelf, it could be a refrigerator, it can be a cooler, and to make sure that you are catching all the debris that's coming off of that frozen turkey. Also, and this is always hard for some, is don't wash your turkey. You don't want to spread the salmonella that's already on that turkey throughout your whole kitchen. Anything that's living on that bird, unless it's been time temperature abused, and we'll get to that in just a second, will be destroyed in that cook process, because you're starting your cook process between 325 degrees to 375 degrees as you're preparing that turkey. So time temperature abuse. That is when you let a food, it could be turkey, it could be your vegetables, it could be anything that's on that table left out too long. Now, referring back to the turkey, if you let the turkey thaw out in unrefrigerated scenes, you're going to multiply and divide those bacteria, that salmonella, every 20 minutes, and you don't want to do that. So for safety's sake, allow the time, don't wash the turkey, and put it straight into the oven after you've prepared it. Another thing that I see is people want to cook their stuffing inside the cavity of the turkey. We do not recommend that you do that. The cavity is deep. The turkey is a thick process. It's cornbread. It's all the ingredients that are in there. That turkey itself has to be cooked to 165 degrees. The stuffing has to be cooked to 165 degrees as well. For those two foods to reach the potential of 165 degrees, they have to be cooked separately. Now, if you want to stuff the turkey after the stuffing or the dressing is completed, and after through cooking, and also the turkey, by all means do that, but cook them separately. Another thing that I see that people that they don't want to, like you were saying, there's a lot of cross contact. You want to make sure that there is a spoon or a fork or a knife for every portion of every service that you have. You don't want to double dip into a different food. You want to eat, I guess an example would be mashed potatoes and gravy, but you don't want to see gravy in the mashed potatoes or mashed potatoes in the gravy. You want them separate. You want a separate spoon for both of them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, fully understand. And I want to kind of talk about something else real quick though. When you kind of talk about, food safety, you mentioned kind of, temperature and, making sure you thoroughly cook. It, you know, would you recommend, there might be some people who think, oh, well, I'm just going to last second it, I'm just going to do it as is. Would you recommend, and if I guess this is kind of, it's a bit of a personal question, but it's also a bit of a health question. Let's say that the turkey comes out a little pink, and there's some concerns about that. Would you recommend serving that, or would you say, you have to have a white turkey when it comes to, making sure it's safe to eat?
First of all, you can't see, smell, or taste any microorganisms. You do not want the turkey to be pink. You want it to be cooked thoroughly all the way through. You want to invest in a thermometer. Now, I realize that all the turkeys that we've seen throughout our lives have the thermometer that pops out. Even though that thermometer is there, you still want to have a second thermometer on hand, and you want that temperature of that turkey to 165 degrees. You check it in the thickest part of the breast, thickest part of the thigh, thickest part of the wing. Do not touch the bone because that bone is going to get hotter quicker. Any type of other debris that's going to be in the bird, fat's going to get hotter quicker. You want to take the temperature with that thermometer, and it must be 165 degrees. That's USDA recommendation.
All right. And then, of course, Thanksgiving leftovers, that's a huge deal, of course, because you have these big meals. However, there's probably some people who are going to try to make those last as long as possible. When it comes to
Exactly.
storage, when is it time to say, okay, it was great having this. It's time to throw it out.
Number one, when in doubt, throw it out, regardless of if it's been in the refrigerator 1 day or 3 days. Now, to specifically answer what you're needing, once that food is consumed, you have leftovers, like you were saying, you can keep those leftovers in the refrigerator 3 to 4 days. In the freezer, and a lot of people freeze their leftovers, they can be in that freezer for 3 to 4 months. Just be sure refrigeration or refrigerator date them, because especially in the freezer, you're going to look at that container and think, oh, when did I put that in there? And having that date and time also is going to help. Now, what if you have a large portion of dressing or a large portion of another hot food, macaroni and cheese, or think about your favorite side. Green bean casserole is a regardless of what it is, and you want to make smaller portions because there's still heat in that food. So you want to reduce that heat before you put it into the refrigerator or the freezer, because you don't want to have you don't want to grow bacteria. You don't want to that hot food or warm food to absorb anything else that's in the refrigerator or vice versa. So you want to put them in a container with a tight fitting lid. If you choose to use zip bags, double bag those zip bags because they are plastic. They will puncture. So if something happens let's say that something happens during the freezing process and it's pushed up against, somebody's really helping you and it gets pushed up against something else and that outer bag gets punctured. Well, if it's not double bagged, it's going to go everywhere. You're going to have frozen, whatever the food is, all over your freezer. And not to mention, you're going to have a mess to clean up. It's going to smell bad and it's just going to be a mess.